Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The National Government's mismanagement of housing in New Zealand is now chronic. It's not just a housing bubble in Auckland, it's a housing crisis nationwide. And it's causing a firestorm of economic and health and social issues throughout the country that'll drag New Zealand down for decades to come. If you look at the results in Auckland alone, you can see the magnitude of the problem. First of all, ordinary people simply can't find a house within their price range to buy. And too few are being built. We need at least 13,000 houses a year in Auckland alone, but what we find is less than half of that is still being built per year in New Zealand. And the National Government's known that for years and has done little or nothing about it. And first home buyers, even if they can find a house to buy, can't afford to purchase it. And they're forced into long-term rentals. And that's why the term generation rent has been applied to them, applied for the first time in New Zealand. But the problem is, of course, that they can't afford to rent those properties either because of the huge rent increases that are actually driven by the increase in house prices. So they have to move down market and down market, trying to find lower and lower rents so that they can afford it. And to make things even worse, immigration at a net 70,000 a year, most of whom actually go to Auckland, greatly exacerbates the problem. And the root cause, Mr Speaker, of this is that successive governments have failed to plan for housing needs over decades. They've never developed a genuine long-term strategy. They've let the so-called market reign, and most people know that in New Zealand the market will never cope alone. And the government is penny-pinched wherever possible, fobbing off housing issues, especially social housing issues, off onto other organisations, most of which can't cope either. And the government has always failed to integrate housing provision with resource management, immigration, transport and social security policy either. Now, Mr Speaker, New Zealand First says that we should be taking a long-term view and there should be direct government investment in the housing market and not the zero investment policy that this government has taken. And that is contrary to the approach which needs to be taken in New Zealand. So, Mr Speaker, New Zealand First calls upon the government and all parties to support the establishment of a housing commission so that we get a non-political approach to solving New Zealand's long-term housing problems. Mr Speaker, we need to revamp New Zealand's housing market with a number of objectives. And the first is residential and land home ownership affordability. That's the fundamental problem. Also social housing supply, security and affordability, planned government investment in land development and low-cost first home purchase finance, which is also something that is desperately needed in New Zealand at the present time. In addition, sustainable housing objectives such as including energy sustainability and efficiency is also required, as well as housing quality generally. Mr Speaker, we also need integration of new housing developments with sustainable transport systems. That's something that really doesn't happen in New Zealand anywhere and should do so. And that is what is happening overseas. Mr Speaker, New Zealand First also believes that it's very important that overseas purchasers should not be able to buy residential property in New Zealand. Right. And we believe that they should be ineligible and that they should have to apply to the commission of which I spoke for a permit to buy a house in New Zealand, and that should only be granted if they could demonstrate a genuine need, and that shouldn't be difficult. That should be difficult to do, rather. We would also reduce immigration to sensible and sustainable levels, which is not what we've got in New Zealand at the present times, and immigration needs to be aimed at meeting genuine skill shortages in New Zealand instead of the open slather we now have.
The Honourable